Okay, so the final episode has dropped, and there is so much to talk about. I'm going to try to keep this within an hour, but I took a lot of notes. So let's address the obvious. We did not see Beth, which sucks. Yeah, let's just say it. That sucks. But I want to reiterate something that I've already said, and that is that it's very clear that originally it was going to be both Daryl and Carol doing the spinoff, and then as we know, something changed for Melissa and she couldn't do the first season. So we didn't want to say this at first because we didn't want to believe it, and we just wanted to believe that we would see Beth in the first season, but I think it's pretty obvious at this point that the two of them need to be together to go looking for her, just like they did in season 5 in Consumed. And I'm going to show you that there is evidence that they are going to replay that, especially near the end when we do see Carol at the end of the episode. So especially with the panel that they did this past week. And okay, let me just say a quick word about the panel. I'm going to talk about it in a lot more detail later this week. I've got a lot of stuff to talk about and a lot of stuff to post, but we've got plenty of time. People are going to say all kinds of things about the panel. I don't know if you've watched it. I would encourage you to watch it. Honestly, it's a little bit boring. Okay, they do not say anything about romance or Daryl's love life or the shipping wars. I mean, the reason I point that out is because I kept hearing things before I watched it. I kept hearing and reading that the Carolers were mad about this because he disrespected Carol, and they confirmed that there would be feelings between Daryl and Isabel and all this different stuff. And then I watched it and I was going, they're not saying anything like that. Like, it was really small potatoes in which they mostly talked about the inception of the spinoff, meaning they talked about how they pitched it to Norman and Melissa originally, and then what it was like to shoot in France, and told some funny stories and stuff. And that was really it. So anyway, the reason I bring that up is because they did tell a story about how they got on Zoom with Norman and Melissa and pitched them the idea that they wanted to do for the spinoff, and they were both really, really excited about it. You know, Norman apparently cheered and Melissa just sort of giggled, and they were both immediately on board. But we do know that eventually something changed and Melissa had to pull out of the first season. So my point is that when that happened, I think they had to come up with a story for season 1 that did not include her. And it's a great story. I've actually really enjoyed the Laurent story, and I really liked this last episode. I really liked where they went with it. But the point is, we were probably never going to see Beth in the first season because Carol wasn't there. And based on the symbolism and the mythology that they established back in season 5, she has to be there. So even though it sucks that we didn't see her, I want you to know that I'm not worried about it right now. And yeah, it's longer to wait, but we've also discussed that maybe they'll have more hints of it in the last part of Fear the Walking Dead. I mean, we've got, this coming up that has the return of Troy after the return of Madison. We still have a lot of things coming up that will be interesting to see where they go with it. And I still, especially based on that very last sequence with Carol, I 100% believe that Daryl and Carol will come back together, and then they will stumble into Beth somehow. So I really, really do think that. We also have the mystery of who or what returned that she said on the radio, and, what does that have to do with everything? But we'll get to that later. There were a lot of really interesting symbols in this episode that scream Beth. A lot of them were not standalone symbols. A lot of them were sequences. So I'm just going to jump right in now to the episode, and let's talk about them. So we start with seeing the bodies at Normandy. Now, I did read one of the reviewers, I don't remember which, that said something about how they wished that they had spread this history of Daryl's out over the entire 6 episodes rather than the final one. I do actually agree with that. I mean, I really loved this whole World War II thing that they integrated into his story, but I think it would have been more powerful if they had dropped hints all along the way. Like, if the first episode had shown his grandfather lying dead at the beach in Normandy, we would have wondered what that was the entire, 6 or 8 episodes before they revealed it, and I think that would have been better, but that's okay. I still really, really liked where they went with it. So we have this, first of all, we see that, and we don't really know what it is, and then we jump into this really crazy Quinn and Daryl versus 4 walkers sequence, right? Well, we have, first of all, the one that he was facing off with at the end of the last episode, which he kills relatively quickly. But there is something that I want to point out in this sequence. So we have the super walker. I always thought this walker was a little bit reminiscent of Beth because it's wearing green and it has blonde hair. Now, that's about it. It's about all you can say. Otherwise, not too much. But he ends up grabbing the French flag and using the pole to stab the walker in the head. Okay. I thought about that a lot, and it's interesting. I think it points to a couple of things. First of all, when we get to the end, we find out that Daryl really does have some ties to France, and he is starting to realize that, and I think that's important, and I'll get to that when we talk about the ending. But it also occurred to me that this might be symbolic of the fact that he needs to be in France, or something about him being in France is how he's going to achieve victory. He had to use that French flag to kill the walker. And by the way, he stabbed it in the head really pretty dang close to where Beth was shot in the forehead. I'm just saying. But I feel like if they just wanted it to be like badass Americans here to kill the walkers, it would have been an American flag. And no reason they would have had an American flag hanging in the arena. But the symbol is very potent there that he actually used the French flag to kill this walker. So we always like to say that the CRM war is coming, and now we have these walkers that they're experimenting with where the virus is kind of going crazy and exploding in these weird ways. And we've always thought that Beth would be a weapon that would help Teen Family eventually, defeat the CRM and everything. And I kind of feel like this is similar, like something about him being in France, something about the French connection, if you will, is going to be what helps him achieve victory over these crazy walkers. Maybe he needs to be here in order to learn to fight them, in order to learn what's really going on, and then he will end up using that to help the good guys win in some way. It also could be a direct link to Beth. He needs to be in France in order to find her, and she will be the thing that will help Team Family win the war, something like that. But I thought it was really intentional that they had him use the French flag to defeat that walker. I felt like that was on purpose as a symbol, okay? Then after that, they bring Quinn out, and it seems like Daryl and Quinn are going to have to fight to the death, and I just had to laugh at how absurdly confident Quinn was. He's just like, oh, it's okay, Daryl, I'll make it fast. I'm like, dude, on what planet do you think you're going to beat Daryl? Like, Quinn was toast the minute that happened. But of course, it doesn't really play out that way. They end up kind of working together to deal with these walkers. Now, again, I felt like the way that the walkers were killed, the sequences we see here, were really intentional from a symbolic standpoint. The first one we see, its head explodes. So we have Daryl seeing that sometimes whatever it is they're doing to make these walkers superhuman, it doesn't always work. And, I almost feel like that's, it could be symbolic or a foreshadow of an immunity thing. Like, some people, it makes, whatever it is they're injecting the walkers with, it makes them superhuman, but others it kills. And I don't know, maybe it'll be something where, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they start using these on people eventually to try and make the people superhuman to kill the walkers. But a lot of them it's going to kill, and it's going to start exploding heads. And clearly Janae and her ilk don't care about that. They don't have much humanity or compassion in that regard. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting, and it'll be interesting to see where they go with it. But, so they start fighting. We also see that Sylvie, Emile, and Felu are in the audience, so we kind of know Daryl's got some allies there. But when he and Quinn start fighting the other three walkers, well, first of all, one of them attacks another one, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not sure what that's foreshadowing, but one of the walkers attacks another walker. So it's like it turned on its own kind, and that really shouldn't be happening either. So that was interesting. And then there were two more that they actually had to fight. One of them, Daryl takes off his leg. The one that eats, I'm just looking at my notes here, the one that eats the other one, it rips off its jaw. And that, again, it's a really specific symbolism. So let's talk about these things. For the leg, it's probably part of the lost leg, lost shoe, lost foot symbolism that we've seen a lot. And that generally represents two characters being separated for a long time and then coming back together. So we specifically saw this, just to give you an example that we can 100% back up, when Rick and Michonne were fighting walkers in the schoolyard in Say Yes, which was in season 7/12, Rick pulls the foot off of a walker. And, it's just supposed to be this kind of gross thing where he's like, ugh, and, this foot comes off and they're trying to kill this walker. So it's frustrating that he couldn't drag the walker away from Michonne because its foot just came off in his hand. But again, they use that as a symbol, and then everything about Say Yes was clearly a foreshadow of Rick's arc, because later on he falls into the walkers when he falls off the Ferris wheel or whatever it was, and Michonne thought he was dead, and then they reunite and she knows he's alive. And then that was clearly a foreshadow of when he fell off the bridge and she thought he was dead for a long time. Now she has some inkling that he's alive and she's going to look for him, right? So the lost shoe, foot, to whatever you want to call it, there's lots of names for it, is always indicative of that. And we did see that around Beth, which is clearly a foreshadow of her and Daryl being separated. We also saw it around Al and Isabel in Fear the Walking Dead, and then they were separated for a long time. They actually came back together already in that show. It was a little bit of a smaller arc. But anyway, so I thought it was interesting that one of the legs were taken off. Like, that could be a big foreshadow of something. Then the jaw is sort of like not being able to speak. So there's a big theme in the show that's the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. And I think it might be part of that. Like, they took the jaw off. And I'm not sure exactly how to articulate what that's going to foreshadow, but it's just something that we've seen before for sure. And then the third one that they were trying to kill had some sort of metal around its head, like its head was in a vice or something. And they keep hitting it on the head and can't kill it because it glances off the metal. Now, we have seen things like that before. And what people have theorized is that it could represent Beth getting shot and not dying, like she's taking a blow to the head but jumping back up again. Of course, they do end up killing the walker eventually because, they're going to have to for the sequence in the show. But the symbolism there is still really, really interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is that when all is said and done and Falou kills Janae's guard, which makes everyone scream and run away because they don't know what's going on, we see this blonde woman who's part of the crowd fall down onto her face, and then someone picks her up and they keep running. Super random, guys. Like, there was literally no reason to show this woman falling down. She's not a character we know. She's just like an extra that's in the crowd, and she's blonde. And I've said before that I think when people fall down, it's a foreshadow of some big arc where they will like symbolically fall down. For example, when Beth and Noah are trying to escape at Grady and they go down the elevator shaft, there's a part where she jumps down by Noah because he fell all the way, down a level lower than her, and she jumps down and falls right on her face, on her stomach. And I just kind of always saw that as a foreshadow of her getting shot. I mean, it's very symbolic because obviously falling down is not the same thing as getting shot, but it's like symbolically she's going to trip and fall in a big way, and that was her getting shot and being separated from the group. Well, this woman did the same thing. She just fell on her face and then got back up, and that was it. And again, there was just no reason to show that. We don't know who this woman is. She's not a part of the story. It didn't bring the story, have it move forward in any way. So again, I feel like they're putting in symbols of Beth and how this is foreshadowing Beth and how it's representing what's going to happen, that sort of thing. So that was a really interesting sequence. And yes, it was really fun and it was really badass and all that. But I was looking at that going, okay, well, this is interesting. It was also, I thought, really fun that the crowd started cheering and calling Daryl's name. And Janae was not happy about that, but he raises the walker's head to the crowd and then throws it at her. It was kind of a very gladiator moment, which was really, really fun. Let's see. So then Janae tells Kudron to go and kill Daryl, and she takes Isabel and Laurent with her. There's a part where I had to go back and watch it again because I couldn't figure out what was going on. Laurent actually tried to get one of the guards' guns, and it didn't work. And then they were just put in the cell. I'm not sure. I feel like that foreshadows something, but I'm not sure what. That was really purposeful that they put that in there, but then nothing really came of it. And then it was kind of fun that Isabel had pickpocketed a key. It was just kind of a fun way to bring her past full circle and show that it served her here. We see Daryl and Quinn running around trying to figure out what to do, and we see a burn on Quinn's back, and at least he says it was a burn and not a bite, but we don't really know what happens when when Daryl was burned at the very beginning, they cauterized his arm, and that could have been to stop the acid from burning deeper, but you also wonder if getting their blood on you, if it could have a similar effect. I don't know. I feel like they're almost hinting at that without saying it. But either way, eventually they come to a point where Quinn is really weak and doesn't want to keep going. Oh, I have this note that when Daryl asks him about the burn, he says, "Let's go." He says, shall we stand here taking a piss or should we go? Now, yeah, granted, I get that a lot of people say that. It's a common figure of speech, but we don't hear it that often in the show. It would be different if Daryl said it all the time and it was just kind of part of his character or part of his speech, but we really don't. And they could have said anything they wanted there. There's like about 100 figures of speech they could have used or could have had Quinn used to say we shouldn't just be standing around, we should go. And they specifically used one that we heard in Still, that we heard Daryl say to Beth, and I don't think we've heard him say that since. I don't know, it almost seems like we've heard somebody say it and we said, hey, that's kind of like what Daryl said in Still, but again, it's not like Daryl goes around saying that all the time. He really doesn't. So I felt like that was a callback. Anyway, so then they basically decide that they're going to cut off Quinn's wrist and that he is going to sacrifice himself so that Daryl can, keep going, get away, try to find Isabel and Laurent. So then the next really interesting sequence comes. Daryl gets outside and he finds a white car. And he opens the car door, the back door, and there's a green bag inside, and he pulls out some weapons, a knife. Now, I kind of glossed over this the first time that I watched it, but then when I was going back and rewatching to get screenshots, it really jumped out at me. I mean, he got in the backseat of a car. We believe that Beth may have been left in the backseat of a car. There's a green bag in there, and he takes weapons from it, which we've always said Beth is going to end up being a weapon for Team Family. But then we can even take it a little bit further because he hears something. He sees that there's this guy laying back there that's dead or dying, I guess I should say. And then he hears something behind another car, and it turns out that it's Falou and Sylvie and Emile. But think about this, guys. He gets into the backseat of the car with the green bag, takes out a weapon, and then immediately reunites with people he knows and trusts. Like, this is kind of his Team Family in France, right? So that felt purposeful to me, like the two were being entangled in some way. And then I also noticed that he left the door open on the car. And we see that a lot. We see the doors open. And every time that we see cars, even just like cars on the side of the road that are not working, that have especially the back doors open, it just feels like a callback to Beth, especially to this where the door was open and Maggie was outside crying. And like I said before, it's because we're pretty sure that when Team Family returned to the car, Beth wasn't there. So it's just like a callback to that and saying, pay attention to the open doors, pay attention to the idea of somebody getting out and leaving the door open. And this kind of felt symbolically like that. The other thing is that Sylvie and Emile have kind of come to represent for us. They do represent Beth and Daryl because they're in a relationship, but specifically they represent Beth and Daryl from season 4 rather than now because they're young, because it's just kind of the budding romance. They both seem very, very innocent about it. The fact that Sylvie was a nun and so she's never done this before feels a lot like Daryl and them saying that he didn't understand the feelings he had for Beth, that sort of thing. So not only was he reuniting with people at this point, but two of them were Sylvie and Emile, who represent, in my mind, him and Beth from season 4. So like I said, it's just jumping out at me, the symbolism, in a big way. So then Daryl does end up finding Laurent and Isabel, but they're on the other side of a locked iron gate. Now, this is most definitely a replay of that dream/near-death experience that Daryl had when he fell into the water several episodes ago. It's set up exactly the same way. And I'm going to need to think on this a little bit more because I can tell that I haven't quite wrapped my head around everything that this symbolizes, but in the dream Daryl had, Laurent just prayed and the walkers went away. Here, that clearly was not the case. Laurent had to do something more physical in order to kill the walker, and he didn't want to, but he did it. And so, but the question of faith was still there. Laurent was obviously reluctant to kill the walkers, probably especially because it was Quinn. Even though he didn't really like Quinn, it was somebody who knew and somebody he consciously knows is his father. But Daryl had to say, God will forgive you. It'll be okay. You need to help Isabel. So the question of faith was definitely still there. And I almost feel like the first one was internal, which is kind of obvious because it was a dream. And this was more external. It was more real life and what's going on. And there's also a theme of because they talk so much about his father, which I'll get to in a minute. Chronologically, they hadn't yet at this point, but about him not becoming his father, and so Laurent killing his father. There's something specific about that plays into the theme of Daryl and his father. So that was really, really interesting, and I think Daryl didn't really care for his father, so he has no problems with symbolically killing his father or not becoming his father because he thinks his dad was a deadbeat and an asshole. I mean, that's what he told Beth. But this is another thing that I want you to wrap your head around. They're doing this whole thing with Daryl and his father, and I actually really like it, and I actually really like learning this stuff about him, and I like where they went with it. But one of the last times we heard him talk about his father was to Beth. So they're bringing these themes back, and they're bringing them back in a big way. I don't think I would have guessed that when Beth, anything about Beth's return would dig this deeply into Daryl's relationship with his father, but I think it's fabulous. Anyway, so that was interesting, but Laurent does do it. And I mentioned this before. It's similar to when Carol wanted Mika to kill the deer and learn to take care of herself, and she wouldn't do it. And as screwed up as the Lizzie and Mika story was, it was a big theme on the show that people need to learn to do the hard thing and take care of themselves, even though a lot of times it's really messed up. They still do, or else they die, because that's just the world that we live in. And it's not making a statement about what should happen, just what the reality is of, the world of the Walking Dead and the Walker apocalypse and all that. So Laurent did do it, and he probably will survive long term because he's learning these kinds of things from Daryl and he's willing to take them on. But that is also a parallel to Beth because she did too. So based on the precedent, the pattern that they've always set, she should have survived. You know what I mean? Because she was as strong as she was, and she did change. They even went out of their way to say that when they were talking on the porch, and still she says, I wish I could just change. You did. Therefore, she should be able to survive just as Laurent has survived. The reason Mika didn't survive from a thematic standpoint is because she wouldn't help herself and learn how to survive on her own. And that, unfortunately, usually leads to death for the character. Anyway, so we just saw more of that. Well, okay, so they managed to kill that Quinn, it was Quinn, and then, everybody's okay. They make it back out to the cars where they say goodbye to Falou and Emile. Now, it doesn't actually tell us why they're leaving or where they're going. Emile says they have to go where they're most needed, so I'm assuming they have somewhere in mind that they want to go help somebody, but they don't give us a whole lot of detail about where they're going or why they're not coming to the nest. But here's the thing that jumped out at me. Remember that I told you that Emile and Sylvie represent Beth and Daryl from season 4 and 5 when they were younger? They separate here. Once again, that's not something that they absolutely had to do. Maybe they have some storyline in mind for season 2. I'm sure we'll see Falou and Emile again, but given what really didn't happen at the end of this, all that happened was they went to the nest, they were there, that's all Sylvie did was go to the nest and be there with Isabel and everyone. So why didn't they just send Emile with her? You know what I mean? Like, why go out of their way to have her and Emile split up and not even give us a very good reason for why? It's symbolic, and it shows that it's like a parallel to Beth and Daryl from season 5. It's obviously much less traumatic. They're choosing to go their separate ways and knowing that they'll see each other again sometime in the future, so it's a little bit different. But symbolically, they're going their separate ways, and they don't really know when they're going to see each other again. So, it just feels like a callback. They get in the car after the goodbye, and here's the other thing. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Oh, so Emile, when he says goodbye to Sylvie, he says, I hope you'll join us soon, which I'm hoping is a foreshadow of Beth joining us soon. And then here's the thing, is Emile walks away. So if we're talking about, for kicks, let's put it this way, if we're talking about Emile is supposed to be Daryl from season 5, and Sylvie is supposed to be Beth, not only do they separate and go their separate ways, but Emile walks away with someone he knows, just like Daryl left with Team Family on foot. Sylvie gets in the car with Daryl here, but if you think about this, it's a blue car, and she gets in and is driven far away. So it just feels, again, like very on-the-nose callbacks to season 5, and they're trying to tell us that this is what happened before, then it's Sylvie, of all people, who actually does ask Daryl if he's ever been in love. And of course, he doesn't answer. But I think it's really significant here. We're going to talk about the whole Isabel situation. He doesn't look at Isabel when she says that. You would think if he were developing feelings for Isabel, he would have looked at Isabel. He doesn't. He kind of does a very Daryl non-committal grunt sort of thing. But he doesn't say no either. So it's very ambiguous, and of course they're totally teasing us with this, but I don't know, it was interesting that it was Sylvie who asked him that. He was trying to comfort her and tell her that, Feather would make sure that Emil was okay and everything. And then it's her, of all people, who asks if he's ever been in love. I thought somebody would ask him that, but I thought it would be Isabel. And I thought that we had passed the point when she would. I was thinking that was something that would happen like in the first episode when he's in the bath and they're talking, And so I just kind of had dismissed that. And then when Sylvie actually asked him that, I kind of, oh my gosh, she asked him, And of course, he doesn't really answer, but it's part of the theme of this is going to be what leads to his happy ending. But the way that they did it and the way that they're so non-committal about it, I think is really important. But again, we'll talk more about the ending of this and the Isabel situation in just a minute. So anyway, right after that, the car seems to kind of break down. The engine is having trouble. Oh, I forgot something. When they get in the car, so Daryl still has the watch that Aslan gave him. Now, W.D. Ray was talking a lot about in a lot of detail this past week. It's, stuff I haven't really gone over with you guys because it was after I recorded all my Ask videos. And the point that she was making is that, and I did do an edit about this, that there is a cross on the end of the watch. So there's the gold watch that has the picture of the castle in it, and then there's a chain, and then there's a cross on the end. Okay, so it's almost like a rosary. It really is almost like a cross, and that's an important symbol because not only do we have the healing of time, which I talked about before, which calls back to Still and the grandfather clock, but in so many ways, the watch literally feels like a symbol of Beth. I mean, Aslan had it, and he's the Christ figure. He was kind of, in a symbolic way, the way he died felt like a little bit of a crucifixion. And then there's also the fact that he fixed the watch, and the watch, in them, Daryl fixed the music box, and the watch and the music box are kind of similar. I mean, they're both small but complex machines that have like gears that fit together in similar ways, right? So there's a lot of symbolism there, and a lot of ways in which the watch with the cross on the end feels like it's a symbol of Beth. Now, he wrapped it around the rearview mirror, and the first thing I thought about that was that it was similar to Conquer. At the very beginning of Conquer, which was 5/16, it was the finale of season 5, so only a few episodes after Coda, and we saw Morgan interact with one of the wolves. Wolves are another symbol of Beth, and we saw callbacks to them last episode when the people Daryl was trying to get ethanol from were luring walkers into big trucks with music and strobe lights, right? Major callbacks to that. But Morgan, he basically takes out the two wolves, like knocks them both out, puts them in their car, and there's a rabbit's foot wrapped around the rearview mirror, and he smiles and takes it. And back in the day, there were all kinds of posts about rabbit's feet and what it represented and how it could represent Beth. And so when I saw Daryl wrapping this watch around the rearview mirror, it kind of felt like the same thing to me, and it feels like, I mean, he's putting the watch there because it's a symbol to guide them toward where they're going, right? It's almost like putting it up there and being like, okay, this is where we're headed, and that's why he puts it there. And that's literally true in the plot because they're going to the place, what is it called, San Michel? That's the castle that's in there. But if it's a symbol of Beth, it also shows that maybe she's guiding him or maybe she is their ultimate destination in a symbolic way. W.D. Ray also pointed out that wrapping it around the rearview mirror shows you where you've been, not where you're going. And so it also could be showing the past, which is Beth, and the mirror, again, if the watch represents Beth, he's wrapping it around the mirror, showing that, like saying this is in the past where he did. I'm sorry, I'm not explaining it very well. If Beth was his past, and then Sylvie specifically asks him, have you ever been in love? Well, we have the symbol of Beth wrapped around the rearview mirror, which is the past. Do you see what I mean? So it's just another way that it feels like it's invoking Beth and making him think about her. Okay. So I think, trying not to backtrack, I think that's most of what I had for that part. Then after that, the engine sputters, and they have to pull over to work on the engine. Okay, guys, this is another big one. We see Sylvie and Laurent sleeping in the very back of the car. Once again, if Sylvie and Emile are Beth and Daryl, then Sylvie is a Beth symbol. Laurent, all through this, has been a Beth symbol in a big way, okay, because he's supposed to be the Messiah, he's the Christ figure. I've gone on and on about all the parallels he has with Beth. So we have two different Beth figures, characters who represent her, who are sleeping in the very, very back of the car. We believe that Beth was left in the very, very back or trunk of the car. You see what I mean? Like, the symbolism is so potent. And it's like, how long have they actually been here? A minute ago, they were both awake, and Daryl pulls over to work on the engine, and all of a sudden, they're both completely asleep in the very back of the car. Like, have they been here for an hour or what? You know, it doesn't tell us, but they're going out of their way to give us these symbols, and I think that let's just say that they make me really, really happy. Okay, now we get to the point where Isabel and Daryl talk about a lot of things, really. She tells him that there were times that she lied to him. This is something I want to point out, that even at this point, she obviously has come to care about him. She smiles at him several times. She clearly wants him to stay, but she always couches it in what he can do for Laurent. And I'm not saying that maybe she hasn't developed some feelings for him, but she never says she wants him to stay. She says she wants him there for Laurent, that Laurent has never had a father figure in his life. He's never had this influence on his life before, how much he's changed since Daryl got there. And that, guys, let's just face it, that's 100% true. For a young boy, he was raised by nuns who loved him and cared for him, and because of that, he's a really decent kid, and he's very compassionate, and those are all good things. But when he has a man to look up to, he's going to want to emulate that man, simply because it's a man and because he's a boy, and he has someone now, a father figure, to look up to. And of course, he's going to latch on to Daryl. And Isabel's seeing that, and she knows that it's going to hurt Laurent if Daryl leaves. Okay, but I just think it's interesting. I kept waiting to see if they would have her say that she wants him to stay for her, and she never said that. And again, I'm not saying that maybe there isn't some hint of that there, but she's not actually saying it. The talk of Daryl's grandfather at Normandy was really, really interesting. And again, I kind of wish that they had spread this out a little bit more over the series. I think it would have been more powerful that way. But I still really liked it. It was an interesting story. But again, there's a couple of things I think we need to pull out of this. One is that it's very much about Daryl's father as much as it is about his grandfather, because what he's trying to say is that history has been repeated several times. His father took off to fight, his grandfather took off to fight the war, and that left his father fatherless. And then his father repeated that. He became an alcoholic, and Daryl and Merle were pretty much fatherless, and what father they did have was not pleasant, you know. And they're kind of using this to say that he shouldn't abandon Laurent, but at the same time, he has these other kids to take care of in Alexandria that he also left, and if he doesn't come back, that would sort of be like abandoning them. So it is a really difficult decision to make. He's come to care about all these kids. He is a father figure to them, and it's like he's being asked to choose between them, which is really not cool. You know, it's rough. The other thing, and this is another one that I feel like I need to tease out a little bit more, it also has to do with, I think repeating the past is a big, just a big theme for the show in general. Like, even outside of Beth, it's about learning from your mistakes. You know, you're going to do something over and over and over again until you learn from it and sort of transcend it. So, talking about the past and repeating the past, Daryl has been stuck in some pretty terrible emotional cycles, you know, and we want him to get out of that. And I think getting out of that is how he will finally find his happiness and find Beth. So I've talked about the faith thing, that he's going to have to come around and have faith. And he is getting there. I thought it was, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, but at one point he tells Isabel that he respects her for her faith. And back in season 4, that wasn't necessarily the case. He was, it was him lashing out and being angry, but he was telling Beth, you know, faith ain't done shit for us. And he clearly doesn't believe that anymore. So we're seeing his progress, right? So I think a lot of this is about breaking out of negative cycles in a way. And it's clear that he didn't really respect his grandfather for going to France and, you know, dying there on the beach, because Daryl saw it as an abandonment of his family. And so it's really interesting when we actually see the graveyard scene, which I'll get to in a minute. Anyway, so him and Isabel talk about this, and it is very important. And I do think they're bonding over it a little bit. I had to laugh when Isabel said she thought he was dangerous at first, and Daryl like laughs at her like, "You're funny, Isabel." You know. Anyway, it was just Daryl being Daryl, and I'm here for it. I thought it was hilarious. I'll probably make an edit of that later. But of course, inevitably, danger shows up. Cordon shows up. Now, this was super interesting. In a lot of ways, I'm somebody who loves villains, and I love to dig into them and who they are and why they do what they do. And I'm suddenly kind of in love with Cordon right here, not only because he doesn't kill everybody. Obviously, I wouldn't like him if he'd killed Laurent and Daryl and Isabel, but we aren't really told why he backs off, and it's really interesting to me. It was like really intriguing that he did that, and they didn't tell us why. It would have made more sense for Daryl to defeat him, for them to kill him off, or even if they didn't kill him, to smack him over the head and run, or you know what I mean, something like that. But he specifically chose not to kill them. I don't think it had anything to do with Daryl. I do think it had to do with Laurent. Now, even though it's been really subtle, Cordon has kind of shown interest in Laurent in the past. I started thinking about when he first came into the Abbey, and again, he was looking for Daryl, but when the nuns were trying to hide Laurent from him, and when he realized Laurent was there, he said, "Okay, we'll be taking him with us." And it's like, well, why? I mean, you're kind of assuming that it's because Janae wants him, but Cordon was not working for Janae at that point. He came into her service after that, so where was he going to take him? And he actually tells Janae in this episode that the reason he killed her men is because they wanted him to kill the boy, and he couldn't do that. So something about Laurent appealed to Cordon, and he did not want to kill him. And like I said, I think he genuinely this whole time has wanted to kill Daryl because Daryl killed his brother. But I think the reason he didn't kill him in this moment is because he sees that Daryl is trying to protect Laurent. And then he even sort of helps them in terms of telling them what to do to get to the nest. So it makes me wonder if Cordon is, I don't know, secretly working for the good guys or something. And once again, really genuinely wanted to kill Daryl, but he left him alive so that Daryl could get Laurent to the nest or something. I don't know. But that was really intriguing to me. I didn't see that coming. And now I'm really interested in Cordon and where they go with him. So I actually really liked that. Isabel is stabbed at that point. And I actually really loved that too, that Laurent told Cordon, "God loves you." I don't know if that's the reason that Cordon backed off, but I will say that Cordon, even though he's not terribly religious, he does seem to be at least a little bit respectful of religion, because he knew where the nuns were the whole time, and you know, don't get me wrong, he's done some bad things. He sanctioned his men killing off all those nuns, so he didn't really hesitate to kill them, but before they basically pissed him off and were working against him, he did leave them be. So he wasn't someone who was going to go take stuff from these nuns or anything. You know, he's got a little bit more respect than that, even if it's not... I'm not saying he's a hero. He did still murder a lot of those nuns and allow his men to do that. But anyway, like I said, it's just interesting because he has shown murderous tendencies, and yet he let them live here. And I really, really want to know why. I think that's really, really intriguing. Okay, so they actually take his advice. They burn the car and go on foot, and they eventually do reach the nest. And it's interesting that there are people there waiting who cheer and welcome them, but I think it's mostly about Laurent. They have heard news and, you know, what Isabel has always said about him, thinking he's the Messiah. So Daryl's group are received with a lot of happiness and cheering, and, you know, they get a lot of help from these people, and they seem to be really good people. We also learn that... I don't know if I wrote down his name. The leader there is actually American. Now, I really want to read into this. Daryl goes to France and finds another American there. Makes you wonder if there are any other Americans that will be there, or if it's maybe just a foreshadow of finding Carol there. I don't know. But that's interesting. And the guy says he's from New Jersey, which is not that far north of D.C., where Alexandria is. I mean, obviously, it's up near the top of the country, but still, it's not like, you know, 3,000 miles away cross country on the West Coast. I mean, that's really not far from where Alexandria is. It's also up near the Canadian border, which is interesting. So I think they chose that purposefully. I won't say I know exactly what it's leading to, but I thought that was interesting. From there, we see, you know, him just really coming to know these people and getting comfortable there. So this is where we got to talk about the Isabel stuff. We do see a lot of scenes of him looking at Isabel and her looking at him. Now, I know that there are going to be people who are going to have a meltdown about this and feel like that they are putting Daryl with Isabel. I still don't think that's true. Number one, because of all the Beth symbolism we're seeing. And number two, even if we put the Beth stuff aside, even if you don't believe Beth is coming back, okay, so let's put it aside for a minute. Here's the thing, guys. He still leaves her. I think, let's see. I've got a lot to say about this, so let me gather my thoughts here. I've always said that even though Isabel definitely is reminiscent of Beth in some ways. I mean, she's got the blonde hair. She's kind of a warrior. A warrior nun would be a kind of funny way to describe Beth, especially in the early seasons. And she's got the scars. I mean, obviously there are things about her that would remind him of Beth. And you could argue that maybe if there is some attraction there, it's because she reminds him of Beth. But overall, despite all those similarities, I still feel like when it comes to functionality in the story, Isabel is really more of a stand-in for Carol than she is for Beth. I've said that all along. And that is literally true because of what I said at the beginning, that originally it was supposed to be Daryl and Carol, and since Carol was not going to be in the first season, they had to find a stand-in for her. So overall, I feel like still that this is more of a Carol relationship than it is a Beth relationship. Now, here's what I'm going to say, though. I'm not going to deny that they're sort of playing with it. They're sort of acknowledging that something might be there. But here's the thing, guys. Do you remember that they did that with Carol, too? I don't know if everyone remembers that. You may have read it if you followed me for any length of time. But I've said it for a long time. Back in episode 301, which is where they first took the prison, there's this part where Daryl is on top of a bus keeping watch and Carol goes up there. And it's the part where he massages her shoulder because the kick from the gun had made her sore. And then she says the thing about want to screw around, and they both laugh and jump down. To me, you know, the certain shippers look at that and say that it was romantic. For me, I'm not going to say that there wasn't a hint of romance there. I think that was the writers acknowledging it. So what I mean is, by the time they did that in season 301, there were already people who were shipping Daryl and Carol because of everything that happened in season 2 with Carol's daughter, Sophia. Sorry, I blanked on her name for a minute. When Carol runs toward the barn when she sees Sophia and Daryl grabs her. I mean, there's just certain things that made people ship Daryl and Carol, even at that early point. And so I think that them doing that scene with the two of them on top of the bus was the writer acknowledging that there was some possibility that maybe in some version of reality it could have happened, There's a part where Daryl is massaging Carol's shoulder and he looks at her. And I think at that moment it was crossing his mind, like, could this go that way? Could this be romantic? And I'm not at all saying that he was in love with her or had feelings for her. I'm saying intellectually it crossed his mind. Could this turn into that? And then when she started laughing about it and said, want to screw around, and laughed, he was just kind of like, oh, okay. And again, I'm not saying he was brokenhearted about it at all. It was just like he needed to know how she felt about that. And once she did, he was fine with that. And they were just best buds after that forever, right? So I feel like this is kind of similar. I feel like they are teasing us with Isabel a little bit, and they are acknowledging that something could be there and that there's a possibility of it. Now, realistically, do I think he could be with Isabel? If we were talking about the real world and he did end up staying there with her and Laurent, yeah, I think that he could, because we all know, they've shown us over and over again that Daryl's very lonely and that he wants companionship. But here's the thing. Number one, I think we all know that he's not going to stay there long term. He's not, whatever he chooses for right now is one thing, but he's not just going to stay there and never see Rick again. They're clearly going somewhere with this, okay? He's got a lot more story to tell and a lot more battles to fight, okay? Number two is that we still have really, really heavy Beth symbolism around him. So even if there's a possibility of him and Isabel, I don't think that's where they're going with it. They're teasing us, they're foreshadowing things, but I personally think overall that Isabel is probably going to get killed off in season 2. I don't know for sure, but it's just my personal feeling, especially if she's a stand-in for Carol. When Carol comes back, they're just not going to need her character a whole lot anymore. So I think there's a good chance she's going to get killed. But more than that, all of that is kind of my conjecture based on what they've done before and the symbolism I'm seeing. But let's talk about what actually happens in the plot. we do see him looking at her a lot. We do see her looking at him, and then they talk when he's helping her wash her wound, and she says it feels like home, and that clearly gets to him. Like, yeah, like he could almost see it being home. And he even says that it grows on him, right? After all of that, and then after she basically begs him to stay when she realizes he's leaving, he still leaves. I mean, when I was watching it, I kept thinking that at any time he was going to choose to stay on his own, and he never did, you guys. He never did. He didn't choose to stay beforehand. He didn't choose to stay when she basically asked him to. He went to see Laurent, and I was thinking, like I said, every single scene, I was thinking something was going to happen. You know, she came to talk to him, and maybe she'll talk him into staying. Oh, no, okay, she didn't. So then he goes to see Laurent, and I was going, oh, maybe Laurent will wake up and cry and ask him to stay, and then he'll stay. Nope, he didn't stay. He didn't say goodbye to Laurent, which, by the way, is a Beth callback about not saying goodbye. So then he leaves, and he's thinking about it. Like when it showed him and it was raining and he was in a barn by the fire, he was obviously thinking it over and still being torn about it. And I went, maybe he's going to go back. Nope, he didn't go back. Then we have the scene with the graveyard, which I will go into in more detail in just a minute. But because he got emotional about that, and I was thinking, you know, they're establishing that maybe he really does have family ties in France. And he's thinking to himself, maybe I do belong here because I actually have a family member who died here. And so it's not a matter of he has no ties to France. He has blood ties to France because his father died there at Normandy, or his grandfather died there at Normandy. And so I thought, okay, maybe this will convince him to stay because he's thinking, I do belong here. Nope, he still went running after that boat. So my point is, with Beth, he had been with her for several weeks on the road in season 4. Every bit as long, maybe longer, than he has known Isabel. And they'd been through some stuff together, just like him and Isabel had been through some stuff together. And Daryl was ready to put down roots and stay with Beth, and even abandon Rick to stay with Beth. And that was not the case with Isabel, okay? Because he saw Laurent there, I'm sure he will stay for now, because he's not going to be like, bye, Laurent, have fun, going back to the castle, good luck with all the walkers. You know, of course, he's gonna figure something out. But it was not Isabel that got him to stay. If anything, it will be Laurent that gets him to stay. So even if something could happen with Isabel, I don't feel like his feelings are strong enough to stay with her. If he did have a relationship with her, it would be closer to Leah. I think it would be, don't get me wrong, I think it would be way less toxic than Leah's was, because Isabel is not Leah. But it would be because it's convenient, and because it's there, and because he's alone and he's lonely. It wouldn't be something he chose and went after. Okay, that's what was made really, really clear to me by the end of this episode. He did not choose to stay for Isabel. And if Laurent had not shown up on the beach, Daryl was like running toward that boat. And when it was clear that they saw him, he smiled. I mean, he wanted to go home. He was ready to hop on that boat and get out of Dodge, right? And the only reason he stopped is because Laurent appeared. So just keep that in mind. The other thing is that the way, and this is another writing thing, a precedent thing, the way that they write romances, it's not that they're always love at first sight. In fact, they've done some funny things with the characters not liking each other too much at first. The first time Rick and Michonne met, she told him never to touch her again, which was funny to look back on now. And they kind of did the same thing with Sasha and Abraham. Sasha was not impressed by Abraham at first. So I'm not saying that it's always insta-love, but at the same time, they always have hints to what it's going to be. So the first time Rick and Michonne met, they like locked eyes across the fence, and then when she passed out, he picked her up and carried her bridal style. So even if they didn't like each other very much at first, there were hints about where it was eventually going, right? The same with Abraham and Sasha. There was definitely hints to where it was going, and there were some that I didn't pick up on it was actually in them. So it was when, after Coda, after Tyrese, everybody was walking. And remember the whole episode, everybody was super, super depressed. And this is when Daryl cut himself burned himself, by the barn. Abraham talks to Sasha and he said, hey, you've got friends. It's okay. And he's like, I just thought it was him trying to lift her up. And I was like, oh, that's nice, but I didn't realize that they were actually heading toward a romance with them. So anyway, my point is that there's always hints to where it's going. And I get that you could see this is like a major hint to where it's going with Daryl and Isabel, but at the same time, him leaving her, to me, it just shuts that whole thing down. I don't think he would have left. I think if he truly had the feelings for her that he needs to have in order for her to be his happy ending, that it would not have played out that way. I do think because of some of the other things I've talked about, that like the French flag, that maybe he needs to be in France in order to find his happy ending, or in order to be able to eventually help Team Family, fight all of their battles and be victorious. So there's reasons that he needs to stay, but I don't think that reason is Isabel. Okay, so that is my 2 cents on that. I hope that makes some people feel better. WDWA also pointed out that in the scene where he's helping her wash her wound, she probably looks a lot like Beth to him right there. She has her hair down in a way that would be reminiscent of Beth. So I did notice that he rubbed his chin, and somebody had asked me about that before. If he does that, doesn't that prove that he's thinking about it? And yeah, it does. But again, is it because he's genuinely thinking about Isabel, or is it because he's thinking about Beth? Because she was the one that we originally saw him doing that with. So it could be a callback to her. But the other thing, like I said, is that Daryl is a human being and he's lonely. And yes, he is thinking about it. We know he's thinking about it from all his reactions to, being asked if he has a wife, and, everyone's got someone waiting for him, and his head goes down and all of that. So we know he's thinking about it. But in the end, again, if his full, what his intention was that he wants to find someone to be with no matter what, I think he would have stayed and pursued her, or at least asked her if that's something she was interested in. He didn't. He left her, and he was going back to America. So that tells me that his heart is not there with her. If it was, he would have stayed, the same as he would with Beth. He tried to with Beth. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about the cemetery scene. I've actually been waiting for this scene because I saw just a real quick clip of it in the trailer that showed him coming up and the crosses behind him. And maybe it was just the way the trailer was and the way the music was in the trailer, but I was like waiting for that scene because it was such a the cinematography is there, and I really wanted to know what that scene was about. I did kind of assume that Isabel and Laurent would be with him when he went there, but they weren't. And I don't know what to say about where they're going with this symbolically necessarily, except to say that they are, giving us more information about him and his heritage. And again, this is something that goes back to, I was thinking that obviously the father comment goes back to something he told Beth in Still, but he didn't mention his grandfather, and maybe he wouldn't have because they weren't talking about that. But I was also thinking that Rick mentioned his grandfather who fought in the war, and that was in Them, which is a really important Beth episode when everyone was super depressed, and that's when Daryl fixes the music box and then it wakes up, okay? But Rick talks about his grandfather who fought in the war and always said, wake up and survive, then you get to live. And Daryl didn't really like that. He didn't like being compared to like the Walkers and saying that we are the Walking Dead. You know what I mean? So I think there's, like I said, I need to think about it more. I think there's a lot of nuance and a lot of depth here that we're probably not going to pick up on just by watching it once. I do also think they're going somewhere with it, but I'm not sure. I feel like it's going to come full circle, and maybe we'll understand it more what they were going for the next time that they come around to this. But once again, I really thought when I was watching it that seeing his father or his grandfather's grave, sorry, I keep saying his father's, it's his grandfather's grave, would make him want to stay, because it would be like he actually does have blood ties to France, and maybe he would see it as a sign that he's meant to be there with Laurent instead of going home. I really thought that's what it was going to be, especially because he got so emotional upon seeing that grave. But then he still didn't. He still jumped out on the beach and tried to go to the boat and was planning to leave. And that's interesting, because maybe in a way it was the opposite of what I thought. Maybe it confirmed to him that he needed to go home, because he didn't want, he didn't want Judith and RJ to become him, in the sense that he left, died on some distant shore, and would be buried there. And that's been a big theme too, of constantly Laurent saying to him, you're not going to die in France. And now we understand, and this is why I think they should have spread this out a little bit better. But looking back in hindsight, every time Laurent said that to him, you wonder if Daryl was thinking about his grandfather and the fact that his grandfather came to France and never came home. And so he sees this grave for his grandfather and he cries. And that was really powerful. And I got to say, I mean, part of the reason that I love it is I have grandfathers on both sides of my family who fought in World War II. Neither of them died there. They both came home afterward, but there are stories and it changed them. And so any talk of the war like this and Normandy and all of that, it speaks to me. I get it. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting, and I wish that they would give us a little bit more. I wish we could know what was going on inside of Daryl's head at that point, but I feel like the fact that we saw him find the grave and then have an emotional reaction to it, and then he was like I said, practically running toward that boat, and he smiled when he saw the boat. I mean, he was ready to go home, and the only thing that stopped him was Laurent. So I'm sure he'll stay with Laurent in the moment, because now he's got to get Laurent back to safety again, and Isabel's probably freaking out somewhere. I'm sure Laurent took off after him without telling anybody. But you get the idea. I thought it was a really beautiful sequence, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope that they give us more of that. But bringing it back around to Beth, the other thing that I thought of is that this is a replay of what happened in Alone. So think of it this way. The thing that made me think about it is the gravestone. In Alone, him and Beth go through the cemetery. He's carrying her on his back, and they stop and they see a gravestone that says "Beloved Father." And she gets kind of emotional about that, and it's obvious that she's thinking about her dad, who died pretty recently at that point. Now he here sees a grave, and it's his grandfather, but still, we're talking about a paternal lineage, and he gets emotional about it. So it's a parallel and a callback to what happened in Alone, so we can bring Beth back around into it that way. But I also think the sequence is really interesting. You know me, I love the patterns in the sequences. So Beth and Daryl are together. I actually didn't talk this out with myself beforehand, so I'm just doing this now. They go through the graveyard. They see the gravestone. Then after that, they go to the funeral home. At the funeral home, that's where we do get about the only romance that happens between them. The candlelight dinner and the, locking gazes and the O. But that's also where we see the serious symbolism. We see the one-eyed dog, and then that's where she's taken. So now here, we have him walking, in this case by himself, and he comes to a graveyard. And he sees a gravestone that it doesn't say father on it, but it has his grandfather's name. And I noticed that it said Georgia on it, which was really fun. I mean, that's compelling to me. It's calling back to Georgia, which is where he lives, or where he grew up, I guess I should say. But Georgia is also calling back to Beth. It's calling back to everything that happened in Georgia, right? And that's where he last left Beth. Then after that, he goes to the beach. And just the fact that it's the beach, that it's a boat, that it's ocean symbolism, all of that is Beth symbolism. But then Laurent calls him back. Now, once again, I've said this like 10 times already just in this episode, Laurent is a stand-in for Beth. Isabel is more of a stand-in for Carol, and Laurent is a stand-in for Beth. So it is Beth that calls him back. Now, which leads me to another thing I want to talk about, which is the changing your mind motif that they have. Okay, so this was something that I didn't put together for a long time. Let me explain. I promise I'll be brief, the way that it came together for me. So there's a part in season 6 when they're doing Operation Lead the Walkers Away, and Daryl is supposed to go with Sasha and Abraham, but he leaves to go look for Rick because he's afraid Rick is in trouble. And he searches everywhere for him and can't find him. And then eventually he goes back to Abraham and Sasha. And I was always confused by that because it doesn't tell us why he goes back or what he's thinking about. But the point is, he doesn't keep searching for Rick. He goes back to them. And I remember after that happened, at the time, I couldn't wrap my head around what it meant at all. I was just confused. And I was going, okay, that means something, but I have no idea what. Like, that was the weirdest behavior on Daryl's part, because it would be one thing if he actually said, okay, I can't find Rick. He's going to have to figure it out on his own. I'm going to go back to Sasha and Abraham. At least that would be a reason. We would get his logic, right? But we didn't get anything. He was searching for Rick. We saw him pull over and be really, really distressed that he couldn't find Rick. And then all of a sudden he just goes back to Abraham and Sasha like nothing even happened. And it was weird. And I remember that there was something that came out where Norman was answering questions, and somebody asked him about that, and he would not elaborate on it. All he said was, well, there was more to it than just finding Rick. There's a bigger reason for it. And beyond that, he wouldn't say anything. Now, that never led to anything. It's not like later on in the season, they told us why he did that and everyone was like, oh, yeah, no, nothing like that, right? We never found out what that was. And so all that tells me is that Norman is very aware of the symbolism. He's very aware of the patterns and the motifs and what they're doing with it, but he just knew he couldn't tell the audience that. He wasn't able to answer that question. He would have had to go into a great deal of symbolism and arcs and callbacks to Beth and all kinds of things, okay? Eventually, I kind of figured out that it was that it had something to do with Beth. And the reason that I figured that out is because Sasha and Abraham were so clearly a proxy for Beth and Daryl. And so I was going, okay, I feel like it represents him first being loyal to Rick and going looking for Rick, but then eventually changing his mind and going back to Beth or something. Beyond that, I didn't know. But we've seen similar things to that several times where, you know, it's different situations and everything, but the sequence or the symbolism is the same. I didn't really put it all together until Find Me, because with Leah, something similar happened right at the end. He kept leaving her literally to look for Rick. He was looking for Rick's body, right? And at the end, he left her, and then it shows him in the woods. He's with Dog, and all of a sudden, it's like some sort of light bulb goes on for him, and he stops and turns around and goes back and writes that note for her saying, you know, I do belong with you, come find me. And I had to watch Find Me about 20 times before it really came together, and I realized that it was part of the same symbolism. He was out looking for Rick. Something changed his mind, and they will not tell us what the freak it is. They never give us his thoughts, which is frustrating, and then he goes back to her. But we also thought that Leah 100% was a stand-in for Beth, and it was a foreshadow, and obviously Leah in the show was very toxic, but it was a symbolic foreshadow of him eventually finding Beth. So it was only then that I actually realized that this symbolism actually literally does stretch back to Beth. It stretches back to Alone when she says, what changed your mind? Because in every case, it's him changing his mind. He picks one path and it's not the right path, and something changes his mind. And I think the reason they're not telling us what changed his mind symbolically is because we know from Alone the thing that always changed his mind was Beth. She was what changed his mind. And they can't say that in these sequences. It wouldn't make any sense, for one thing, because she's not in the show right now and she has nothing to do with what's going on plot-wise in these sequences. But if they were to, you know, give him some thought about Beth or have him mention Beth, I mean, it would just be too obvious, right? They're not going to tell us that. So the point is that this is another example of that. We have Daryl choosing a path. This is where he's going to go, and something pulls him back and changes his mind. I reiterate, it is not Isabel that changes his mind. It is Laurent showing up. So I was actually kind of looking forward to this because I read something somewhere that I was like, oh, that's going to be another like Daryl changing his mind sort of situation. And so I was excited to see what they did with it. And it was pretty subtle. I mean, it wasn't like boom, boom, boom fireworks or anything. But you could also see it if Laurent is a stand-in for Beth as a foreshadow of how he's going to find her. Like, maybe he'll, you know, Carol will come get him and he'll be just about ready to leave with Carol, and then Beth will literally show up and call his name. I mean, I would love that. And I kind of feel like whether it's literal or symbolic, Laurent showing up, that was very purposeful. Okay, again, if they were going to make him be with Isabel, they would have had Isabel show up. It would be like a sappy romance where somebody's getting on a plane and the person shows up at the airport and therefore they don't get on the plane or something like that, right? But that's not what they did. It's Laurent that shows up, and Laurent is a stand-in for Beth, right? So yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'm still trying to figure out, like I said, I think that there are things I'm going to figure out later on that are, I haven't quite wrapped my head around yet. So I'm trying to think of what the graveyard would represent and how Rick figures into it and how that is going to lead to Beth showing up. But I feel like this whole sequence was really, really intentional and that it's a foreshadow of something. So that's really basically what it comes down to. And he was left trying to decide what he wanted to do. I also wanted to see if he was happy to see Laurent. Now, he didn't look angry to see him, and there was a part where I almost thought he was smiling, but then he really wasn't. So he wasn't particularly happy that Laurent was there. He didn't seem upset by it either. I think it's just a matter of him not knowing what to do, and he's trying to decide because he obviously cares about Laurent. But man, he was excited to get on that boat and go home. So and, I'm sure that the writers purposely didn't want to put too much emotion into his face one way or the other. They're kind of leaving it up to us to figure out what he feels in that moment. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about, and I promise I will wrap it up. I know I'm running along here, but there was a lot to talk about, and I'm sure there will be a lot more. This week I'll do more Ask videos, and I've got some people who have asked me to talk about specific things, specific topics like the panel and everything. Like I said, I've got lots to post this week. But we have this final coda, if you will, of Carol. And of course, it's what got the carolers all excited and everything, and which shows that she's going to be in the next season. They have confirmed that on the panel. I was still a little bit unsure. Yeah, is it going to be a flashback? Is she really going to be there? No, she is going to be there. She is going to be a series regular. But here's the thing. We see someone riding a bike. And I didn't even realize, but as it turns out, it's Daryl's bike, and it's somebody else riding it. And so Carol recognizes it. She's looking for Daryl. She's in Maine, which is where she last knew that he was, and she sees this guy riding his bike. So she starts chasing him. And of course, the guy turns around, shoots her engine out. She gets out of the car. She asks him. He doesn't know who Daryl is. This guy was kind of idiotic. He had her open the trunk and then leaned over. And I was just thinking that. I was like, she's going to smack him over the head as soon as he does that. Yeah, sure enough. He clearly has not met Carol before. But here's the thing. The car Carol is driving, it is a blue car. It is a Mustang, so it has a horse on the front of it. Horses are really a Beth and Daryl thing, okay? The first evidence we had of that was Buttons, and Buttons was Daryl, not Beth, but it's because of what he said to Buttons. He said, you used to belong to somebody, now you're just yours. So he was comparing himself to the horse and being lonely because he had lost Beth. And it's, guys, I'm sorry, I have to geek out about it a little bit. He says, you used to belong to somebody. That is him admitting that his heart belonged to Beth, okay? Other people just blow past that and don't want to acknowledge it. Yeah, 100% that was him admitting that he had feelings for Beth. So don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Anyway, so the horse is a callback to Buttons, which is a Bethel thing. The blue car, I feel like just the fact that it's, I don't know, depending on the color, I suppose we would read into it if it were green or yellow or red, which is like most of the colors. Like, I get that. But even so, it's a blue car. We feel like there's a lot of theories that Lakari's Dodge might be the car she was left in, and it was blue. Anyway, so there's that. But what really caught my attention was the license plate. Now, I usually leave license plate to W. Dewey because she is really good with the numbers. But in this case, the thing that jumped out at me is that there is a 502 on the license plate. Guys, episode 502 is Strangers. That is literally the episode where Daryl and Carol jump in the car and go look for Beth together. How many times have I said that Carol coming in to the spinoff is going to be them together, which will end in them finding Beth? Okay, they're literally giving us the episode number where that happened before. Then she leaves this guy in the trunk, which I thought was funny. I was kind of laughing when it happened. But there's also something yellow up by his head. I'm not sure what that is. It just looks like some sort of wiring in the trunk. But there's yellow in there, and Beth would have been left in the car wearing her yellow polo, right? So we have trunk symbolism, we have the yellow, we have the blue car, we have the horse, we have the freaking 502, and now Carol is going to find Daryl, and I'm telling you, it's going to end in them finding Beth. So does it suck that we didn't get her in season 1? Yes, I am 100% with you, but I am also 100% sure that we're still going to see her in season 2. And there's also the possibility, we've got other things before then. We're going to have Fear, the second part of Fear, which is going to be about Troy's return. There's always a possibility she could turn up someplace else first. But either way, I'm not worried about it not happening. I don't think that she's not going to return now. I still 100% think that she's going to return, and we're going to see her. And everything, all of the symbolism, everything is leading to that and pointing to that. And I'm excited to see how it all plays out. So, like I said, lots more to talk about, and I will be back doing more videos and talking about it later this week. But even though I know we didn't see her, and that's going to be disappointing for everybody, I still hope that you enjoyed the episode. I thought it was really beautiful where they went with it, where Daryl was concerned, and I actually really, really liked it. So, anyway, we'll talk about more in coming weeks, and we will just all have to wait a little bit longer to see the reunion. But I promise it's coming. All right. Everybody have a good day. All right, guys, before I end, I actually finished the analysis, and then I was going through screenshots, and I realized something else. So I decided to record it and just add it on to the end. First of all, I know my audio is not great today. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure why. It's my microphone acting up, and we're getting a little bit of feedback. But I don't really want to re-record everything because it's over an hour long. Anyway, so I'm sorry for that. Hopefully it's not too distracting. So here's what I realized. I was going through pictures and of screenshots, and I found this one that is Daryl passes the walker with that's impaled on the tree, with the tree through it. You know, it's kind of, the tree is growing through it, kind of. And I realized that I didn't talk about that. And it's interesting because he saw that on his way. We saw that in the very first episode. I'm assuming it's the same walker, and I'll find both pictures so we can compare. But the point is, he saw this walker when he was leaving the beach originally, and now he's seeing it when he's going back. Even if it's different walkers, he's seeing the same thing twice. So it is a way to bookend the beginning and ending of season 1. But I was staring at this walker, and I really started thinking about it, and I realized, you know, I said before in terms of the grave and his grandfather, that I don't think I'm quite wrapping my head around what they want us to be taking away from that. And I'm sure there's a lot of things. I'm not saying this is the end all be all, but I believe this is one of them. There's a huge, huge sacrifice motif going on in this season. Okay, so these walkers on the tree, they do represent kind of a Christian paradigm. The reason being that Christ was crucified on a wooden cross, and very often, even in the Bible, it's referred to him being crucified on a tree. And it's because it was literally, you know, in biblical times, they would have cut down a tree and made it into a cross. So it really probably was the better part of a tree trunk. And they have this thing where I was thinking about Abraham, not TWD Abraham, but like biblical Abraham, the patriarch, that they say that when he was killed, he was put inside the hollowed out trunk of a tree, and the tree was cut in half. And of course, it's a very gruesome way to die. But the point is, people say that symbolically he died in Christ because the tree represents Christ. So the point is that these walkers that are impaled on trees, they do represent someone who's been sacrificed or crucified. So there's a sacrifice motif going on there. Of course, we saw it many other places, too. We saw Isabel sacrifice herself to Quinn so that Daryl could get Laurent out of Paris, which didn't entirely work, but still the sacrifice was there. We saw Quinn do it as well. Maybe it wasn't quite as chivalrous, but he sacrificed himself so that Daryl could get away and go find Isabel and Laurent. Of course, we had Aslan. And Aslan had the name of the Christ figure from the Chronicles of Narnia, and he ended up being impaled on a telephone pole, which is also wood in the shape of a cross. And we actually did see a telephone pole in this episode. I just noticed it in the background, and it was only because I talked about that before that it jumped out at me. Anyway, the point is, in Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan is the Christ figure, and he goes to be a willing sacrifice so that he can defeat the queen. And that's a big part of the story in Chronicles of Narnia, and they gave this guy in TWD his name and then impaled him on a tree. And so there's a lot of sacrifice going on here, right? And as I've talked about before, that sacrifice symbolism does go back to Beth, because she was wearing a cross in the hallway at Grady. And I don't think, especially because the shot was so mysterious and we don't entirely understand what happened there, and of course there's the missing 17 days, there is some way in which she was sacrificed so that Team Family could get away and live. I think that happened literally at Grady. And I also think that it's going to lead to the idea that the fact that she lived, that she will return, even the fact that they've been apart for so long, she's learned and grown in ways that will help her to be able to help Team Family live during the war. Like she'll know something or be a weapon in and of herself, maybe not physically, but maybe physically, or maybe just with the knowledge that she has that will allow them to live. So when it happened in season 5, it was both literal. Something about her getting shot is what helped them get away from Grady. And so she was a sacrifice in that way, but it was also a foreshadow of how that would help Team Family live in the long run way later on after she returns. So all of the sacrifice, the point is, it does go back to Beth, and we can connect it to her because they specifically put a cross on her wrist in the hallway of Grady. And then, especially with Aslan, we saw that he had the watch, which also has a cross on it. So there's a direct correlation there. And of course, the other thing I didn't mention, which I've talked about before, is Father Gabriel saying that they had sacrificed one of their own, which didn't make any sense, but we're pretty sure he was talking about Beth, and we just don't understand exactly what he was talking about there because we haven't seen those missing 17 days yet, okay? So I was thinking about this in conjunction with Daryl's grandfather, and then it sort of clicked for me, and so that's why I wanted to add this on to the end. I was thinking about Rick saying that his grandfather fought in the war, but the difference between him and Daryl, you would think that Daryl would have brought it up then, like, oh yeah, my grandpa fought in the war too. But he didn't, and part of that was his grief at the time. He was grieving really heavily for Beth at that point. But I also think it has to do with the fact that Rick's grandfather, clearly came back. He made it through the war. That was the point. And he made it back to his family, and so Rick knew his grandfather. And that's how he was able to tell him the story about, get up, go to work, figure out how to survive, you get to live later, And so you have to wonder now if maybe Daryl had such a negative reaction to that because his grandfather never came back. And so he's dealing with the fact that he wasn't able to save Beth and he lost her. And then Rick starts talking about his grandpa who came back from the war, and Daryl's grandpa never came back. It's just another way in which he lost out on something in his own mind. So now let's fast forward to his Isabel, or his conversation with Isabel, and he really doesn't have a whole lot of respect for the fact that his grandfather enlisted and died in France. He tells her that. He says it wasn't worth it. His family fell apart at home. It just wasn't a good thing. He basically wished that had never happened, because in Daryl's mind, he's thinking that maybe, just maybe, if his grandfather had been around for his father, then maybe his father would have been around for him, and it just would have changed everything. And he's not entirely wrong about that, but he's just seeing it in a very negative light and thinking that his grandfather did not make a sacrifice, or did not make one that was worth making anyway, and if he did sacrifice himself, it just wasn't a good thing. So then he goes and sees the grave, and something about that grave really touches him, and he starts to cry. And then after that, he smiles. And I said before, he was smiling to get on the boat and go home, which I still think is true, but I almost feel like what they're going for here is that he finally gets it. He finally understands the sacrifice that was made, and that maybe it was a good thing. That maybe these men sacrificed themselves so that other people could be free, so that other people could go home to their families. And that's what made him happy to decide to go home to his family. But the point is, maybe he's finally seeing sacrifice as something that is chivalrous and honorable, and even though it's sad, possibly a good thing for the people who can benefit from it. And I don't know, that just jumped out at me as if Beth was sacrificed, and he's finally seeing it in a light of how did it serve other people rather than how did it harm him. That might be a huge step on his progression, on his faith journey, to finally get where he needs to be emotionally and intellectually in order for Beth to arrive. So anyway, when I was looking at this walker on this tree, all of that finally came together and clicked for me. So anyway, let me know what you think about that. And I really am done for the day now, I promise.